In the spring of 1206, on the vast plains near the Onon River, a moment occurred that would reshape the course of world history. Under a sky swept by cold northern winds, the tribes of the Mongolian plateau gathered in a colossal assembly known as the Kurultai. Here, Temujin, son of Yesugei, a outcast warrior who rose from poverty and betrayal, was formally given the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. From this moment forward, the Mongol Empire began to grow at a pace no civilization had ever imagined. But behind the famous conquests, cavalry charges and sieges lies a darker, less discussed layer of warfare. What Genghis Khan did to the wives and families of his enemies became one of the most haunting realities of his rise to power. This story does not rely on myths or exaggerations. It comes from chronicles recorded by Persian historians like Juvayni, Chinese records from the Yuan dynasty, and the secret history of the Mongols, one of the oldest surviving sources on Genghis Khan's world. Understanding what happened requires stepping deeply into the brutal, unforgiving landscape of 13th century steppe warfare. To grasp why Genghis Khan treated the wives and families of his enemies the way he did, we must begin with the world he was born into. The Mongolian steppe was a land without walls, cities, or permanent borders. Tribes fought for grazing land, herds, women, and honor. Raids were common. Betrayal was frequent. Alliances shifted with the seasons. For centuries, kidnapping women and enslaving defeated families had been considered normal, a practical extension of warfare. If a tribe lost a battle, its men could be slaughtered, its herds taken, its women divided among the victors. This brutal tradition shaped Temujin's earliest memories. When he was just 9 years old, his father Yesugei was poisoned by the Tatars. Soon after, Temujin's family was abandoned by their own clan and left to starve on the steppe. His mother Holon once kidnapped herself from a rival tribe, raised Temujin and his siblings alone. They survived by gathering roots, berries, and fish. That childhood created a world centered on survival, loyalty, and absolute punishment for betrayal. As Temujin began rising to power in the 1190s, he followed the long-standing steppe practice of integrating the women of defeated tribes into his own growing empire. Yet he did so with a calculated strategy. He did not simply take women because it was tradition. He used this practice as part of a larger system of political control. When he defeated a tribe, he redistributed its women to loyal warriors as rewards for service. This system strengthened loyalty, created new alliances, and erased the identity of rival tribes by absorbing their families. But when a tribe resisted him or betrayed him, the fate of its women became far harsher. In these cases, the punishment was not merely symbolic. It was meant to completely destroy the enemy's lineage. One of the clearest examples of this happened during his conflict with the Tatars. After decades of blood feuds and ambushes, Temujin defeated them. He ordered the execution of all adult males above a certain height. The women and children were taken, but their fate depended on whether their families had opposed or supported him. Loyal families were absorbed. Betrayers were scattered, enslaved, or separated forever. The message was simple: defy me, and your family disappears from history. But the event that truly revealed Genghis Khan's ruthless philosophy toward enemies' wives came in 1203, during his war against the Taychard, and later against the powerful Merkit and Jurchen clans. These were not simple rival tribes. They were enemies with personal histories linked directly to Temujin's suffering. The Merkit, in particular, had kidnapped his wife Bort years earlier. Although Temujin rescued her, the wound never healed. When he rose to power and gained the strength to crush the Merkit, he unleashed a devastating vengeance. Men were killed, women were divided among warriors, families were torn apart. Yet even here, he acted with a mix of cruelty and cold strategy. Women who had been loyal or who held useful skills, such as weaving, healing, or diplomacy, were treated differently. Some were placed in households of his most trusted generals. Others were integrated into the families of Mongol nobles. Their identities disappeared, but they survived. Those considered untrustworthy or connected to leaders who resisted him often met far worse fates. Sources describe forced relocations, enslavement, and in some cases, execution. The point was not simply brutality. It was to send an irreversible warning. This approach later escalated when Genghis Khan began his campaigns outside Mongolia. The most infamous example occurred in 1211 to 1215 during his invasion of northern China against the Jin dynasty. Cities that resisted him faced merciless consequences. When the city of Zhongdu, present day Beijing, fell in 1215 after a long siege, chroniclers wrote that the slaughter and treatment of the survivors, especially the women, became a chilling story retold across Asia. Women were taken as spoils of war, separated from their families, and distributed among Mongol nobles and soldiers. Although practices varied depending on the commander, the underlying philosophy remained the same. Resistance brought annihilation, submission brought absorption. Genghis Khan understood that the psychological effect of such actions was as powerful as any cavalry charge. Villages and towns surrendered rather than face the horror they had heard whispered from survivors. Another revealing example comes from his war against Khwarezmia in 1002, 119 to 1002, 121. After the massacre at Otrar and the execution of Mongol merchants, Genghis Khan launched one of the most devastating campaigns in medieval history. Cities like Bukhara, Urgench, and Nishapur witnessed unimaginable destruction. When Nishapur resisted and a Mongol commander was killed, the retaliation was catastrophic. Chroniclers like Juvayni and later Rashid al-Din described the city's population being almost entirely wiped out. Women were taken, enslaved, or killed depending on their connections to local leaders. Some were spared for labor or strategic redistribution. Others suffered the harshest punishments. Again, the Mongol approach was systematic. Women of skilled background, such as artisans and textile workers, were preserved for economic purposes. Women connected to noble families that resisted were deliberately targeted to erase the bloodline of opponents. To modern audiences, this aspect of Mongol warfare is horrifying, but to the people of the 13th century it represented a known reality of conquest, magnified by the scale and speed of Mongol expansion. Genghis Khan's practices were extreme not because they were unique, but because they were implemented on an unprecedented global level. By controlling the fate of defeated families, he built an empire that reshaped Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. By removing threats at their roots, he ensured that no destroyed tribe could rise again. His actions inspired terror and obedience, allowing him to conquer regions far larger than the Roman Empire. In the winter of 1219, as cold winds swept across the sands near the Sirdarya, the city of Otrar lay in silence under Mongol siege. Smoke drifted from burning outposts, and terrified families huddled inside their homes, knowing the unstoppable storm of Genghis Khan's army was coming closer each day. This was not a routine invasion. This was retribution. When the Khwarezmian governor of Otrar in Alchuk murdered Mongol merchants and diplomats, he violated the most sacred law of the steppe. In the eyes of Genghis Khan, this was not only an attack on trade but an assault on family, on hospitality, and on the entire Mongol nation. What followed became a defining example of how Genghis Khan dealt with enemies, especially with the wives and families of those who stood against him. Once Otrar fell after nearly 5 months of resistance, the Mongols unleashed devastating punishment. Inalchuk was executed, but the brutality extended far beyond the city's military defenders. Women, children, nobles, and relatives of the governor faced a grim fate. Persian historians documented how the Mongols sorted the population into categories: craftsmen, knowledgeable women, and those skilled in weaving, metalwork, or medicine were spared for use in the expanding empire. Wives and daughters of men linked to the governor were taken as captives or executed depending on their perceived role in supporting resistance. This was not random cruelty. It was a carefully designed message. Genghis Khan wanted the world to know that defying him would not only cost a man his life but erase his legacy, destroy his family line, and scatter his dependents so thoroughly that no revenge could ever rise again. This harsh policy toward enemy families developed from Temujin's own experiences on the steppe. From childhood, he learned that destroying a rival's lineage was the most effective way to end cycles of revenge. On the Mongolian plains, a defeated man's son might grow up and return years later to take revenge. The boy of today became the avenger of tomorrow. To prevent such future threats, Temujin adopted a principle that had long existed among warring tribes: destroy not just the warrior, but the entire chain of loyalty that connected him to his kin. When he united the Mongol tribes in 1206, he formalized these practices into a political system. No rival clan would ever rise against him again. This ideology carried forward into every campaign he launched, shaping the fate of thousands of families across Asia. Another example comes from the battles against the powerful Nayman tribe. In the early 1200s, the Nayman were one of the last great steppe powers standing between Temujin and total dominance of Mongolia. When the Mongols defeated them in 1204, the treatment of their families followed a calculated pattern. Nayman nobles who resisted were killed. Their wives were seized, interrogated, and redistributed among Mongol nobles and officers. Some of the most beautiful and educated women were given to high-ranking commanders or taken into the household of Genghis Khan himself. But their lives were not romantic or honorable. They were political tools used to secure loyalty, create alliances, and break the cultural identity of the defeated tribe. By absorbing noble women into Mongol families, Genghis Khan eliminated the possibility of future Nayman claims to leadership. The bloodline disappeared into the empire. It is crucial to understand that Genghis Khan's actions were part of a broader strategy known as psychological warfare. Modern historians emphasize that he used fear as a weapon. The stories of how he treated enemy families traveled faster than his armies. In many cases, entire cities surrendered without a fight because they feared what would happen to their wives and children. This allowed the Mongols to conquer vast territories with minimal resistance. But when a city chose to resist, the consequences were devastating. In 1218, after the fall of the Khwarizmian fortress at Bishbalik, survivors reported that families connected to soldiers who refused to surrender faced especially harsh punishments. Wives were separated from husbands and sold or assigned as spoils of war. Daughters were taken to Mongol camps. Sons old enough to fight were often executed to prevent future uprisings. The message was clear: loyalty to a defeated leader would cost a family more than loyalty to the conqueror. The Mongol invasion of northern China further demonstrates how women became part of the machinery of empire building. When cities like Datong and Zhongdu fell, accounts from Chinese sources describe how the Mongols sorted captured families. Women were separated by social status. Noble women were often assigned to Mongol generals to strengthen political control over newly conquered territories. Younger women were divided among the lower-ranking soldiers as rewards for service. Some women were kept for labor, especially in textile production, where their skills were valuable. But women connected to the ruling Jin aristocracy often faced the harshest treatment. Their suffering was not just a byproduct of war. It was a deliberate dismantling of the elite families that controlled northern China for centuries. One of the most chilling incidents related to Genghis Khan's treatment of enemy families occurred during the fall of Nishapur in 1221. When a Mongol commander named Tokuchar was killed during the battle, the Mongols carried out a catastrophic retaliation. Chroniclers claimed that the population was almost entirely eradicated. Women were not spared. Giovanni wrote that the city's women, especially those tied to the ruling class, were subjected to brutal punishments or killed alongside the men. Some women were taken as slaves, others relocated, and many were executed because they belonged to families labeled as enemies of the empire. While scholars debate the exact numbers, the psychological impact of this event spread across Persia, causing many cities to surrender rather than risk similar destruction. Yet the fate of enemy wives was not always death or enslavement. Some became influential figures within the Mongol elite. One famous example is Kulan, originally from the Merkit tribe. She was captured and later became one of Genghis Khan's wives. Trusted and respected, she eventually played an important role in advising the Khan and raising key figures within the royal family. But her story, often romanticized, hides a darker truth. She was originally taken during a war in which her tribe was nearly destroyed. Her rise to prominence does not erase the suffering of thousands of Merkit women who were scattered across the empire. Another case is the adoption of women from conquered Turkic tribes who served as diplomats, translators, or household managers within Mongol camps. Their skills made them useful, but they still lived as captives. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Millions lived under Mongol rule. The fate of conquered families became institutionalized. His sons and generals continued the same system. The cruelty shown to the wives of defeated opponents became a foundational part of Mongol governance. It was not mindless violence. It was a political strategy designed to ensure stability through absolute dominance. Destroy the roots of rebellion, and the branches would never grow back. This philosophy allowed the Mongol Empire to rise faster than any previous empire in world history. But it also created some of the most terrifying stories ever recorded in chronicles of medieval warfare. By the year 1220, the Mongol armies had swept across Central Asia with a force that stunned every civilization they encountered. Smoke from burning cities drifted across the skies of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench. Traders, scholars, and travelers whispered stories of Mongol cruelty, their unmatched speed on horseback, and their deadly archers who shot with terrifying precision. But among these tales, one aspect echoed with particular horror. People spoke about what happened not only to warriors, but also to the families left behind. Women, especially those belonging to the ruling or military classes of defeated regions, were treated under a system that was both structured and merciless. It was a world shaped by Genghis Khan's rigid logic of warfare, power, and survival. To understand the depth of this system, one must look at the pre-existing cultural structure of the Mongols. On the steppe, women played an essential role in daily life, managing households, herds, and even political negotiations. Steppe women were respected, independent, and often powerful within their communities. But this respect did not extend to enemy tribes. The women of defeated foes were seen as both spoils of war and tools for reshaping the political landscape. This belief had existed long before Genghis Khan, but he expanded it into a deliberate strategy for empire building. When the Mongols conquered new lands, they did not simply kill or enslave every woman they found. Their treatment depended on a detailed classification system. Women were sorted by age, skill, social status, loyalty, and usefulness to the empire. This system was not recorded in a single document, but revealed through accounts from Persian, Chinese, Arab, and Mongol sources. A woman who could weave fine textiles might be sent to Mongolia to work in noble households. A woman from a noble family could be placed into the household of a Mongol general to legitimize control over her people. Younger women were often distributed among soldiers as rewards, binding the warrior class more tightly to their leaders. But women associated with rebellious husbands or military leaders who resisted the Mongols faced the harshest consequences. Many were executed or sold far from their homeland to prevent any future political threat. During the siege of Samarkand in 1220, this system became particularly visible. After the city surrendered, Mongol commanders with precise discipline divided the population. Textiles, workers, potters, and metal workers were preserved. The wives and daughters of scholars were often spared due to their education, which could be useful in administrative tasks, but the families of soldiers and nobles who had resisted fiercely faced severe punishment. Chronicles mention how the Mongols separated women connected to military households and interrogated them for information. Those linked to resistance were often executed, ensuring that no lineage of defiant leadership remained. The cycle of revenge, which traditionally defined steppe warfare, was eliminated by eliminating entire genealogies. Genghis Khan's environment shaped his choices. In a world without centralized states, family loyalty was the foundation of power. A tribe's strength came not from its territory, but from its bloodlines. Therefore, when he destroyed the families of his enemies, he was not simply acting violently. He was dismantling the political structures that supported opposition. Mongol expansion depended on total submission. By scattering or erasing the families of rivals, he ensured that rebellions would be rare and short-lived. One of the darkest examples of this practice appeared during the final battle for Urgench in 1221. The city resisted fiercely, forcing the Mongols into brutal street fighting. Genghis Khan ordered his sons and generals to break the city's resistance at any cost. After the fall of Urgench, the Mongols executed a massive number of men. The women were divided into groups. Skilled women were transported to Mongolia or Central Asian Mongol bases. Many young women were taken as wives or concubines by Mongol warriors. But the wives of Urgench nobles, especially those who had supported resistance, were executed. Chroniclers documented this scene with grim detail. The destruction of the noble families was not accidental. It was the deliberate elimination of leadership structures that could threaten Mongol rule. This treatment continued outside Central Asia as well. In the Caucasus, during the Mongol invasion of the Kingdom of Georgia and the Alans, resistance triggered harsh consequences. Families connected to noble houses that fought the Mongols were targeted. Some women were taken into Mongol households, while others were scattered across the empire. This fragmentation of families weakened local resistance and allowed the Mongols to maintain control with fewer troops on the ground. But one of the most haunting dimensions of Genghis Khan's policies was the psychological trauma inflicted on the populations he conquered. Stories about what happened to women spread through caravans, refugees, and merchants who witnessed the aftermath. When news of the Mongol destruction reached cities ahead of the army, many surrendered immediately. They knew the consequences of resisting. They had heard of how families were broken, how women were taken, how children were killed or enslaved. This fear became a weapon as powerful as any bow or sword. It is important, however, to acknowledge that not all women suffered the same fate. Some women who entered Mongol households achieved surprisingly high levels of influence. Elite women taken from conquered tribes could become trusted advisors or wives of Mongol leaders. They managed camps, organized logistics, and even took part in diplomatic negotiations. Yet this does not erase the reality that they began their journey as captives. Their elevation served the political aims of the empire. By integrating noble women, the Mongols stabilized newly conquered territories and co-opted local elites into the fabric of their empire. A notable example is the widespread relocation of skilled women from Central Asia to Mongolia. These women contributed to the rise of new industries, especially in silk weaving and fine textile production. Their labor enriched the Mongol elite and reshaped Mongolian culture. Over time, the influence of Persian, Chinese, and Turkic women helped shape the cultural identity of the empire. But this cultural exchange came from a foundation of violence and forced migration. Another layer of Genghis Khan's treatment of enemy families was his practice of adopting children. When he conquered tribes on the steppe, he sometimes adopted sons from defeated enemies if they showed promise or loyalty. This was rare but strategically useful. It created new bonds while eliminating rival allegiances. Yet this privilege was not extended to most boys of conquered warriors, who were often executed to prevent future uprisings. As the Mongol Empire expanded westward, the same pattern repeated in Persia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and northern China. Women became tools of empire, whether through forced marriage, labor, or political restructuring. The suffering they endured created lasting trauma in the regions the Mongols conquered. Generations later, Persian poets, Chinese scholars, and Central Asian writers still mention the horrors experienced by women during the Mongol invasions. These accounts formed a memory that continued to haunt the collective imagination of entire civilizations. What makes Genghis Khan's actions particularly chilling is how coldly systematic they were. These were not random acts committed by individual soldiers. They were part of an organized state policy. Women from enemy groups were weapons in a political strategy designed to reshape societies and secure Mongol dominance for generations. The fate of these women, whether privileged or tragic, was determined by a system built for conquest. It is this mixture of brutality, strategy, and scale that gives the story its haunting power. By the time the year 1227 arrived, Genghis Khan's life stood at its final horizon. From the frigid Siberian forests to the thunderous deserts of Persia, his empire stretched farther than any living ruler had ever controlled. Countless cities had fallen, nations had been erased, new worlds had been forcibly reshaped. And within this vast territory, millions lived under laws and systems he created. Yet among the many legacies of his reign, one of the most haunting was the fate of the wives, daughters, and families of those who dared oppose him. Their suffering was not merely a consequence of war, it was a deliberate political instrument that left scars lasting centuries. Even as Genghis Khan lay dying during his final campaign against the Tangut Kingdom, the stories of what his armies had done to enemy women were spreading across Eurasia. These stories were told in markets from Baghdad to Beijing, whispered by travelers along the Silk Road, and recorded in the chronicles of monks, scholars, and merchants who witnessed the devastation firsthand. For the Mongols, these actions were part of their statecraft. For the rest of the world, they were reminders of a conqueror whose methods redefined the boundaries of brutality and power. To understand why his actions left such a long shadow, we must look at what happened after his death. His sons and generals inherited not only the empire, but also the system he designed. They preserved his laws, including the policies that dictated the fate of enemy families. This continuity amplified the impact of his strategies, ensuring that the suffering he inflicted became a long, lasting part of the Mongol imperial identity. The Mongol Empire did not collapse immediately after his death. Instead, it fragmented into 4 massive khanates that ruled vast regions. Each continued the practice of using enemy women as tools of political control. In the Golden Horde, ruling over the steppes of Russia and Eastern Europe, women from conquered Slavic tribes were taken into noble households. In the Ilkhanate of Persia, women captured during conflicts with local dynasties were redistributed among Mongol nobility. In the Chagatai Khanate of Central Asia, families of rebellious leaders were punished according to the same principles Genghis Khan enforced. And in the Yuan dynasty of China, women from defeated Song Chinese noble families were integrated into Mongol aristocratic households to secure legitimacy. This continuation reveals an important truth. Genghis Khan's treatment of enemy wives was not simply a reflection of personal cruelty. It was a policy so effective in preventing rebellion and cementing control that it became a pillar of Mongol governance. Chroniclers like Juvayni and Rashid al-Din noted how the Mongols examined the families of defeated rulers with careful attention. They understood that a noble woman carried political power. Her marriage, her children, her alliances could shift the balance of regional loyalty. By controlling these women, the Mongols controlled the future. But this system created deep cultural wounds that shaped the memory of the Mongol invasions for centuries. In Persia, poets wrote verses mourning the disappearance of entire families. Stories of women taken from their homes, their tribes destroyed, became part of Persian folklore. In Central Asia, mothers warned their daughters about the Mongol raids long after the empire dissolved. In Russia, the term Mongol yoke carried not only the memory of political oppression, but also the trauma inflicted on families and women. Even in China, where Mongol rule eventually brought administrative reforms and economic stability, the treatment of noble women during the conquest remained a painful part of national memory. The haunting quality of these stories comes from their scale. No other pre-modern conqueror reshaped so many populations so completely. Ancient empires like Rome and Persia took captives, but their actions were limited to specific regions. The Mongol Empire stretched across continents. This meant the consequences of Genghis Khan's decisions spread across multiple civilizations. Entire languages, cultures, and family lines disappeared because of the Mongol invasions. Another layer of this haunting legacy lies in how the Mongols justified their actions. For them, these punishments were not evil but necessary. They believed that the destruction of enemy families was a practical measure to stabilize newly conquered territories. In Mongol political thought, a defeated tribe that retained its noble women could rebuild. But a tribe without leaders, without its elite women, without its kinship networks, had no future. This harsh logic came from generations of steppe conflict. Genghis Khan simply applied it at a global scale. Yet the Mongol approach was not without contradictions. While they destroyed the families of their enemies, they also elevated women from their own society to positions of power unseen in many other civilizations. Mongol women such as Sorgatoni Biki, Torjin Khotun, and Mandak, Hai the Wise played major political roles. They ruled empires, commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and shaped succession. This duality created a unique situation. Within Mongol society, women enjoyed respect, authority, and influence. Outside it, enemy women lived at the mercy of a system built to break their families. This contrast between internal respect and external brutality is one reason why the story remains so powerful. It shows a civilization capable of valuing women, profoundly yet willing to destroy the women of other peoples with calculated precision. This contradiction reveals the pragmatic heart of Mongol politics. Loyalty was everything. Identity meant nothing. A woman from a conquered tribe could become a queen if she proved loyal. A noble woman from a proud dynasty could be executed if her family resisted. Over time, the integration of so many women from conquered regions reshaped Mongol society itself. The empire became a blend of Chinese, Persian, Turkic, Russian, and Central Asian cultures. Many of the wives, concubines, and servants brought into Mongol households carried their traditions with them. These cultural exchanges influenced cuisine, clothing styles, artistic designs, and even diplomacy. Ironically, the brutal system of absorbing enemy women helped create one of the most culturally diverse empires in history. But for the families who suffered, the impact was devastating. The loss of women meant the loss of lineage, heritage, language, and identity. In a time when family was the cornerstone of society, the destruction of households harmed communities for generations. Villages that once thrived disappeared from maps. Tribes that had existed for centuries vanished without leaving descendants. Oral histories faded because there was no one left to tell them. As centuries passed, the Mongol Empire fractured and dissolved. But the memory of what happened to the women of defeated peoples lived on. Historians studying medieval chronicles found repeated references to destroyed families, scattered women, and shattered dynasties. These accounts became part of the historical record that shapes our understanding of Genghis Khan today. While he is remembered as a military genius and empire builder, he is also remembered for the terror his policies inflicted on countless women and families. Modern scholars have debated how much of the brutality attributed to Genghis Khan was embellished by later writers. Some chronicles exaggerated numbers to emphasize the Mongols' cruelty. Others softened the reality to protect the reputation of their patrons. But the consistent pattern across diverse sources confirms that the treatment of enemy women was not myth. It was a core element of Mongol conquest. Today, historians approach this subject with a balanced view. They acknowledge Genghis Khan's contributions to trade, communication, law, and administration. They also confront the devastating human cost of his expansion. His legacy is neither purely heroic nor purely monstrous. It is a complex mixture of innovation and destruction, ambition and brutality, strategy and terror. The haunting nature of his treatment of enemy wives lies not only in the actions themselves, but in their wider consequences. These acts reshaped populations, erased cultures, and altered the destinies of entire regions. The memory of these events continues to echo through history because they reveal the darkest side of empire building. They remind us that behind every conquest lies the suffering of ordinary families whose stories were rarely recorded. In the end, the legacy of what Genghis Khan did to the wives of his enemies is a reminder of the human cost hidden beneath the grandeur of empires. His empire rose with astonishing speed, but it did so through policies that inflicted lasting trauma on countless women and children. This is why the story haunts history. It forces us to confront the reality that behind every legend stands a trail of forgotten lives.